Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about the step-by-step process to make red wine that tastes like store-bought. First, we need to look at the ingredients and what to do when we need to get the color red, you may ask. Well, we're gonna need liquid, sugar, and yeast as the three ingredients to make alcohol. So since yeast cannot be red and neither can sugar, then the liquid has to be red to make your red wine. Usually for simplification reasons, I use water to make my homebrew. However, in this case, when you want to make red wine, I would suggest using juice that is red. For example, cranberry juice, cherry juice, strawberry juice, any type of juice that imitates the color red, and make sure it's dark red, not light red like punch. Therefore, the color looks authentic. And I've tried multiple cranberry juices in the past and they've all failed me because they've had preservatives. What happens when there's preservatives? I put the yeast and the sugar inside the cranberry juice and the yeast won't work. It starts and then it stops at a certain point because the preservatives inhibit the yeast from eating all the sugar, and therefore my fermentation doesn't complete until the end. The solution for this is to buying preservative-free juice, and it's either with a preservative-free mention written on the box, or you can go with the organic brand. And the organic brand, what it is, it's simply natural flavors. Therefore, there's no preservatives like sulfites or any other types of preservatives that'll inhibit the fermentation. So what I took for this wash is cranberry juice, the organic kind, and here it is. We have organic cranberry juice. And just for fun, I've tried this without transforming into alcohol, but just the juice alone, and it was super sour. And I know that when winemakers mash grapes, the grapes aren't necessarily sweet. Some could be sour, and this tartness is what gives the wine that extra wine taste. Therefore, we cannot imitate this with water and food coloring and sugar because the taste will be slightly different, and every type of juice that you use or every type of grape strain will give you different flavors of wine. That's why Porto differs from Bordeaux and different wines, not only because of the color, but because of the flavors as well. So we got the color down. And one thing that I must note is that you want it to have a little bit of tannin flavor. However, since we do not mash the grapes and add the stems and the skins inside the wash for simplification reasons, we have tannin powder. And honestly, I have to say that I've used tannin powder in the past, and what I don't like about it is that it affects the color of your wine. So let's say you have wine, you have red wine, and you add tannin powder. Tannin powder is brown, so it'll make your wine darker and it will no longer have the authentic red wine color. So I'm restricting myself from tannin powder. So far, I'm using the organic cranberry juice, a little bit of water to dilute and to cut costs. And you have to add sugar because there is not much sugar in the organic cranberry juice. And what I do, I add 3 cups of white sugar. I didn't want to add yellow sugar because I want to keep the color the same as the cranberry juice. And this cranberry juice that I have is the actual color of wine. Therefore, I do not want to influence it anyway by adding molasses or any other types of color to affect the homebrew. Once the sugar and water are added to the cranberry juice, I have to make sure that the pH is at an optimal level. And in order to do so, I have a pH strip that I dip inside the wash. And the number that it gives me will determine what to do next. Usually, since cranberry juice or any other berries are on the acidic side of the pH, meaning lower than 5, we would have to increase the pH of your homebrew. And how to do so? There are different ways to increase the pH of your homebrew. And why do you need to increase the pH of your homebrew? It's because the yeast will be happier and it'll be more prone to eating the sugar when the pH is at 5.2. The optimal pH level for the yeast to perform at is at 5.2. And when I made my cranberry wine, I tested the pH and the level was at 3. Therefore, instead of adding baking soda is a way to increase your pH. However, it destroys the taste of your homebrew. It'll make it taste like baking soda, which is not good. And I would suggest not using baking soda because last time I used so, it took me about half the box to increase the pH by a couple of levels. This will waste your baking soda and it'll waste your homebrew because you'll have to throw it away since the taste might be affected. Instead of doing this, we have calcium carbonate. And what this does, you can add it to your wash and it's going to increase the pH at a much quicker level. I used 1 teaspoon of calcium carbonate and it increased the pH from 3 to 4. Since it wasn't at 5 yet, I added a second teaspoon of calcium carbonate, so 2 teaspoons of calcium carbonate in total, and the pH went up to 5. And once the pH was at 5, I knew that it was time to add the yeast in. However, you have to make sure that the liquid is not too hot because the yeast starts to die off at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Therefore, you want to make sure that your wash is cooled off, and in order to do so, you can use a thermometer that I have here. So this is important when you want to make sure the yeast does not die. And you want to make sure that your wash is at a good temperature, so it's warm, because if it's too cold, the yeast will just sink to the bottom and will not eat the sugar. Once the juice is at a good temperature, roughly 26 degrees Celsius, you can add the yeast in. And the yeast that I add is EC1118. I have a little sample here. And what's good about this yeast is that it ferments until the end if there's no preservatives, and the taste is pretty good. It makes it taste like wine or champagne because it is wine or champagne yeast. And once you add it, I add half the pack of EC1118 for my 1 gallon jar. And once I add half the pack of that, if the temperature is not favorable, therefore if it's pretty cold, I would add on top of that yeast nutrients, 1 teaspoon of yeast nutrients. However, this is not obliged. You can finish your wine without adding the yeast nutrients. What these nutrients do, they help the yeast perform at a quicker rate. And once you've added the EC1118 and the optional yeast nutrient, you can mix it up and wait for the fermentation to be done. This should take 1, 2 to 3 weeks. And if you want to let the yeast fall to the bottom of the jar, you can wait a little longer, let the flavors gel together. And as your fermentation keeps going until all the yeast has gone to the bottom of the jar due to gravity. If you want to accelerate the yeast going to the bottom of the jar, you can cold crash it, which means put the jar inside the fridge. And what this does is that when the yeast goes down, the top part will have no more yeast, therefore it'll be clearer. And usually people prefer to drink clear alcohol versus blurry alcohol simply because of how it looks. And once you taste your red wine, you'll see that depending on the amount of sugar you add, if you'd like to make it stronger, you can add more sugar, but you need that little tartness from that cranberry juice for that wine not to be flat. If you just use water, the flavors will definitely not be the same. For those that want to see a little sample of the red wine that my class is making, so you see it's a little dark, which is great because it's red wine color, and it's blurry because this batch has been fermenting for just a few days now. Therefore, the yeast is still added, and the proof is that the airlock is still bubbling. However, if you want to make sure that the fermentation is done, the airlock is not the #1 way to find out. The best way to find out is with a hydrometer and a cylinder, which are right here. And you want to do so by pouring the liquid inside the cylinder and dropping in the hydrometer. And once the fermentation is done, the hydrometer will be floating pretty high between 0.990 and 1.000. And that's when you know that the fermentation is done. Once your fermentation is done and you taste your alcohol, if you don't like it, you can always back sweeten, which is adding more sugar at the end. And this will make your wine sweeter. Honestly, I've tried this one and it's a little on the sour side. Therefore, I would add a little bit of sugar. However, when you add sugar, there's also the risk of making your alcohol stronger. So the sugar will increase your level of alcohol. Why? Because the yeast will transform the sugar into more alcohol. And each yeast strain has a limit. Therefore, let's say your yeast strain can make a maximum of 15% alcohol. If you're already at 15%, although you add more sugar, it will not go to 16, 17, 18% because the cap of the yeast is making 15% alcohol. Therefore, if the yeast is at the cap and it's reached the maximum level of alcohol, when you add sugar, it will simply make the alcohol sweeter and it will not increase the alcohol levels. And if you'd like to book a class, the link is in the description below. We teach you how to make different types of wine, cider, or beer. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.